Book 2, Chapter 5, Part 1 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1 by Henry Charles LEA, Book 2, Chapter 5, C, Part 1. The preceding chapters illustrate some of the causes that provoked popular hatred of the Inquisition, but these were by no means all. It enjoyed, as we have said, enthusiastic support in the exercise of its appropriate functions in defending the faith, but apart from this it had infinite ways of exciting hostility. This was the inevitable result of entrusting irresponsible power to men, for the most part overbearing and arrogant, who owed obedience only to the Suprema and who early learned that, while it might disapprove of their acts, it always supported them against complaints, and, while it might administer rebuke in secret, it hesitated long before it would compromise the asserted infallibility of the Holy Office by dismissal or any other public demonstration. There was no other power to call them to account, and they could rely upon its indulgence. This indulgence they extended to their subordinates, over whom, indeed, they had not the power of removal, and the consequence was that the whole body thoroughly earned the detestation of the people by the abuse of their privileges, creating irritation which was none the less exasperating because its causes might be trivial. The situation finds expression in a Carta Acordada of October 12, 1561, in which the Suprema begs the Tribunals, for the love of God, to inflict no wrong or oppression for, since they are accused when they do right, what is to be expected when they give just grounds of complaint. Whether just or not, grounds of complaint were never lacking. The power of the inquisitor had practically scarce any bounds but his own discretion, and the temptation to its abuse was irresistible to the kind of men who mostly filled the position. In the memorial of Llerena to Philip and Juana in 1506, complaint is made that the officials seized all the houses that they wanted, and in one case, when some young orphan girls did not vacate as quickly as ordered, they fastened up the street door and the occupants were obliged to make an opening in order to leave it. The same spirit was shown to parties not quite so defenseless in 1642, when its exhibition in Cordova nearly provoked a disastrous tumult. There was a vacant house which Juan de Ribera, one of the inquisitors, talked of renting, but he went to Murcia without taking it. On his return he found it had been leased to a son of Don Pedro de Cardenas, one of the veinticuatros, or town councillors. He sent for Cardenas and asked whether he knew that he had engaged the house. Cardenas professed ignorance, adding that if he had not moved his family into it he would abandon it. Ribera ordered him to leave it, and on his refusal, the tribunal took up the quarrel by serving on him a notice to quit. As he did not obey, it cited him to appear and forced him to give security. His kinsmen and friends rallied round him and promised to sustain him by force. The matter became town talk, and the tribunal felt its honor engaged to sustain its commands by violence. It assembled the two companies of soldiers which it kept in the Alcazar, while the caballeros armed themselves and guarded the house. The corregidor appealed to the tribunal not to drench the city in blood by posing the poor civic militia to the swords of the gentlemen, and it consented to carry the matter to the king. The Council of Castile ordered that the tenant be maintained in possession, while the Suprema instructed the tribunal not to yield a jot, but to eject him by whatever means it could. What was the outcome does not appear, but the case illustrates the extent to which the Inquisition magnified its powers and the determination with which it employed them. It was impossible to prevent these lawless abuses. The Suprema might scold and threaten, but as it rarely punished and always protected the offenders, its restraining efforts amounted to little. The visitadores, or inspectors, duly reported disorders, and instructions would be issued to reform them, but to these the inquisitors paid little respect. There is no reason to suppose that the Barcelona tribunal was worse than any other, and a series of reports of visitations there gives us an insight into the evils inflicted on the people. In 1544, Dr. Alonso Perez sent in a report in consequence of which the Suprema roundly rebuked all the subordinates, except the judge of confiscations. All but two were defamed for improper relations with women, all accepted presents, all made extra and illegal charges, all neglected their duties, and most of them quarreled with each other. The fiscal was especially objectionable for his improper conduct of prosecutions and for appropriating articles belonging to the tribunal. He refused to pay his debts. He arrested a candlemaker for not furnishing candles as promptly as he demanded. When a certain party bought some sheep from a peasant and was dissatisfied with his bargain, the fiscal cited the peasant, asserted that the purchase money was his, and forced the peasant to take back the sheep and return the money. Yet the Suprema was too tender of the honor of the Holy Office to dismiss a single one of the peccant officials. It ordered them to be severely reprimanded, a few debts to be paid, and presents to be returned, and uttered some vague threats of what it would do if they continued in their evil courses. The natural result of this indulgence appears in the next visitation by the Licenciado Vaca in 1549. The same abuses were flourishing, with the addition that the inquisitor, Diego de Sarmiento, had accepted the position of the commissioner of the Cruzada indulgence and had appointed as its preachers and collectors the commissioners and familiars of the tribunal, to the great oppression and vexation of the people, whose dread of the Holy Office prevented complaints. Sarmiento was dismissed in 1550, but in 1552 he was reappointed to Barcelona. The fiscal and notary, who were specially inculpated, were suspended for 6 months, and the jailer, for ill treatment of prisoners, was mulcted in 1 month's wages. In 1561 another visitation was made by Inquisitor Gaspar Cervantes, whose report was exceedingly severe on the disorders of the tribunal and drew from the Suprema an energetic demand for their reform. This produced no amendment. The tribunal went on undisturbed until the complaints of the Cortes of 1564 led to another and more searching investigation by de Soto Salazar in 1566. There were not only abuses of all kinds in the trials of heresy, but numerous cases in which, as the Suprema told them, they had no jurisdiction. Apparently, they were ready to put their unlimited powers at the disposal of all comers, and imprisoned, fined, and punished in the most arbitrary manner, gathering fees, commissions, and doubtless bribes, and selling injustice to all who wanted it, while the dread of their censures prevented opposition or remonstrance. In these cases, which were not of faith, the accused were often seized in the churches, where they had sought asylum, and the repeated instances in which the Suprema orders their names stricken from the records points to one of the most cruel results of this reckless abuse of jurisdiction, for it inflicted on the sufferer, his kindred and posterity, an infamy unendurable to the Spaniard of the period. The long and detailed missive which the Suprema addressed to the tribunal as the result of Salazar's report gives a most vivid inside view of the abuses naturally springing from unrestrained autocracy, which, by the absolute and impenetrable secrecy of its operations, was relieved from all responsibility to its victims or to public opinion. The Suprema takes every official in turn, from inquisitors down to messengers, specifies their misdeeds and scores them mercilessly, showing that the whole organization was solely intent on making dishonest gains, on magnifying its privileges, and on tyrannizing over the community, while the defense of the faith was the baldest pretext for the gratification of greed and evil passions. Yet all this was practically regarded as quite compatible with the duties of the Inquisition. The three inquisitors, Padilla, Zurita, and Mejia, were suspended for 3 years and were then sent to repeat their misdeeds elsewhere, and the two former were in addition fined 10 ducats apiece. That an institution possessing these powers and exercising them in such fashion should be regarded with terror and detestation was inevitable. We shall see hereafter how it shrouded all its acts in inviolable secrecy, and how it rightly regarded this as one of the most important factors of its influence, and we can understand the mysterious dread which this inspired, while at the same time it released the inquisitor and his subordinates from the wholesome restraint of publicity. The smothered hostility thus excited was always ready for an explosion when opportunity offered to gratify it. In the desire to stimulate the breeding of horses, a royal pragmatica, in 1628, prohibited the use of mules for coaches. The inquisitors of Logroño, in the full confidence that no one would venture to interfere with them, persisted in driving with mules, and when the corregidor, Don Francisco Bazan, remonstrated and threatened to seize a coach, they told him it would be his ruin. He did not venture, but in 1633 he procured from the Council of Castile an order that no coaches should be used in Logroño, under pretext that they damaged certain shops projecting on the principal street. The fiscal of the tribunal undertook to meet this by asserting that it had a special privilege from the king concerning coaches, but when Bazan promised to obey, it was not forthcoming. The Suprema took up the quarrel and represented to Philip IV the hardship inflicted on the inquisitors, too old and feeble for the saddle. The compassionate king endorsed on the consulta the customary formula of approval, "I have so ordered." The Suprema then applied to the Council of Castile for a corresponding order, and several communications passed without result. Another consulta was presented to the king, who endorsed it, "I have so ordered" again, but the Council of Castile was still evasive. Then the Logroño authorities offered to the Bishop of Calahorra permission to use coaches, and intimated to the inquisitors that, if they would apply for a license, it would be given. The Suprema forbade them thus to recognize the local magistracy, as they had royal authority, whereupon they resumed the use of their coaches. The alguacil of the corregidor arrested one of their coachmen, and they excommunicated the corregidor. The king, December 9th, 1633, ordered him to be absolved, to which, on December 30th, the Suprema replied that he would be absolved if he made application. The Council of Castile presented to the king a consulta, arguing that ecclesiastics and inquisitors alike owed obedience to the laws, and that the corregidor had acted with great moderation. February 5th, 1634, the king enquired what had been done with the corregidor, but it was not until December 16th that the Suprema condescended to reply, complaining bitterly of the slight put upon the Inquisition, when the whole safety of the monarchy depended upon its labors. Finally, on February 15, 1635, the Council of Castile sent to the Suprema a license for the use of coaches in Logroño, at the same time intimating that its tax of media añata had not been paid. In the course of the quarrel, the council presented a very forcible consulta to the king, which exhibits the light in which the Inquisition was regarded by the highest authorities of the state. It represented that everywhere the inquisitors and their officials, under color of privileges that they did not possess, were causing grave disorders. They were vexing and molesting the corregidors and other ministers of the king, oppressing them with violent methods, and frightening them with threats of punishment in order to deter them from defending the royal jurisdiction. Thus crimes remained unpunished, justice became a mockery, and the king's vassals were afflicted with what they were made to suffer in their honor, their lives, their fortunes, and their consciences. Trivial quarrels such as this, developed until they distracted the attention of the king and his advisers, were constantly breaking out and bear testimony to the antagonistic spirit which was all pervading. A long-standing cause of dissension in Logroño may be taken as a type of what was occurring in many other places. Local officials there, as elsewhere, had a perquisite in the public carniceria, or shambles, of dividing among themselves the vientres or menudos, the chitlins of the beasts slaughtered. It was not unnatural that the inquisitors and their subordinates should seek to share in this, but the claim was grudgingly admitted, as it diminished the portions of the town officers, and it led to bickerings. In 1572 Logroño complained to the Suprema that, while it was willing to give each inquisitor the menudo of a sheep every week, the inferior officials down to the messengers claimed the same, and when there was not enough to go round, they caused the slaughter of additional sheep in order to get their perquisite. As the population was poor, living mostly on cow beef, and meat would not keep in hot weather, this caused much waste. Wherefore the town begged that during the 4 hot months the inferior officials should be content with what the town officers received, and during the other 8 months it would endeavor to give them more. To this the Suprema graciously assented, but in 1577 there was another outbreak, to quiet which the Suprema ordered the enforcement of the agreement. In 1584 trouble arose again, and still more in 1593, and in 1601 it reached a point at which the tribunal summoned all the staff of the carniceria and scolded them roundly, giving rise to great excitement. Then, in 1620, there was a worse outbreak than ever, owing to the refusal of the regidor to give one of the inquisitors 2 pairs of sheep stones asked for on the plea that he had guests to breakfast. The angry inquisitor, thus deprived of his breakfast relish, induced the tribunal to summon the regidor before it and severely reprimand him, thus not only inflicting a grave stigma on him, but insulting the town, of which it complained loudly to the Suprema. It is easy to understand how trifles of the kind kept up a perpetual irritation, of which only the exacerbations appear in the records. The privileges of the markets, in fact, were a source of endless troubles. It was recognized that both secular and ecclesiastical officials were entitled to the first choice and to be served first. Those of the Inquisition claimed the same privilege, not only in cities where there was a tribunal, but also where the scattered commissioners and notaries resided. That this was frequently resisted is shown by the formula of mandate to be used in such cases, addressed to the corregidor or alcaldes, setting forth that the rights in this respect of the aggrieved party had not been respected, and that in future he should have the first and best, after the secular and ecclesiastical officials had been served, of all provisions that he required at current prices, and this under penalty of 20,000 maravedis, besides punishment to the full rigor of the law. It does not appear that there really was any legislation entitling the Inquisition to this privilege, but in the frequent troubles arising from its assertion, the inquisitors acted with their customary truculence. A writer in 1609, who deprecates these quarrels, suggests as a cure that the king issue a decree that the representatives of the Inquisition shall have preference in purchasing, and, at the same time, he tells of a case in Toledo where a regidor, who told the steward of the tribunal to take as many eggs as he wanted, but no more, was arrested and prosecuted, and of another in Cordova, where an hidalgo, who had bought a shad and refused to give it up to an acquaintance of a servant of an inquisitor, was punished with 200 lashes and sent to the galleys. In 1608 the Suprema issued an injunction that purveyors of inquisitors should take nothing by force, the significance of which lies rather in the indication of existing abuses than in its promise of their removal. The claim of preference was pushed so far that in Seville in 1705 there arose a serious trouble because the servant of an inquisitor detained boatloads of fish coming to market in order to make his selection, and it required a royal cedula of March 26, 1705, forbidding inquisitors to detain fish or other provisions on the way, or to designate by banderillas the pieces selected for themselves. When we consider the character of the slaves and servants thus clothed with authority to insult and browbeat whomsoever they chose, in the exercise of such functions, we can conceive the wrath and indignation stored up against their masters in the thousands of cases where fear prevented an explosion. It is true that the Suprema issued instructions that all purveyors should behave themselves modestly and give no ground of offense, and that no one should be summoned or imprisoned for matters arising out of provisions, but as usual these orders were disregarded. Insolence would naturally elicit a hasty rejoinder, which, as reported by the servant to his master, would imply disrespect towards the Holy Office, and severe punishment would be justified on that account. End of Book 2, Chapter 5, Part 1. Recording by Margaret Espaillat, Orlando, Florida.